Dawkins' central argument, in his words, of his book, The God Delusion, is this claim that you cannot infer God as the designer of the universe because you're left with the question, who designed the designer? Now, in fact, this argument is a very bad argument for a number of reasons. For one thing, it does not prove atheism, as Dawkins supposes. Even if the argument were entirely successful, it doesn't go to prove that God does not exist. At most, all the argument would prove is that you shouldn't infer the existence of God on the basis of design in the universe, that would be a mistaken inference. So if you believe in God, you should believe in Him on some other basis. The cosmological argument, perhaps, the ontological argument, a moral argument, maybe on the basis of religious experience or revelation. The only thing his argument would prove, even if it worked, is that you shouldn't infer God as an explanatory entity for the appearance of design in the universe. But that having been said, does the argument work? Well, not at all. What he mistakenly thinks is that in order to recognize that an explanation is the best, you need to have an explanation of the explanation. And that is clearly mistaken. For example, if archaeologists were digging in the earth and came across implements shaped like hatchet heads and tomahawk heads and arrowheads and pottery shards and so forth, they would instantly recognize that these were the remains of intelligent design, that there was some unknown group of people who had made these artifacts and they have happened upon them. Now, they may not be able to explain at all the origin of those people, who they were, how they came to be there, but that wouldn't matter to the inference that these artifacts are the products of intelligent design. You don't need to be able to explain the explanation in order to recognize that it's the best. Or again, if astronauts were to find a pile of machinery on the backside of the moon, and we realize that neither we nor the Russians have launched such machinery into space, they would infer that this is the product of some extraterrestrial intelligent designer. Now, we wouldn't have any idea who they were, what they were like, how they got there, but nevertheless, we would recognize that's the best explanation. You don't need to have an explanation of the explanation in order to recognize that explanation is the best. In fact, if you did have to have an explanation of the explanation to see that the explanation is the best, that immediately leads to an infinite regress, so that nothing could ever be explained. It would completely undermine science. So the argument is simply mistaken. In order to recognize that the best explanation for biological and physical complexity in the universe is an intelligent designer, you needn't need to explain the explanation or to explain the designer. That's one flaw with the argument. The other flaw is this. He thinks that the inference to a divine designer doesn't advance your explanatory power because the designer is just as complex as the artifact to be explained, and therefore there's no advance being made. Well, I think that's completely mistaken. That confuses a mind with a mind's ideas. A mind's ideas may indeed be very complex. This mind may be thinking of the infinitesimal calculus or Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory or something of that sort, enormously complex ideas. But a mind as an entity is a remarkably simple thing. A mind is a non-physical, mental or spiritual entity that has no parts. It's not composed, and therefore it has no complexity to speak of. It is probably the most simple thing that we can conceive of. So the postulation of an unembodied, intelligent mind behind the universe is definitely an advance in simplicity over the variegated and contingent constants and quantities inexplicably present in the universe. So for those two reasons, I think this argument, which Dawkins seems very proud of, is really quite sophomoric and quite hopeless. It is astonishing when you read Dawkins how he almost breaks his arm patting himself on the back in self-congratulation for having discovered this argument, when for years people have always said things like, well, who created God or who designed the designer? And